So you decided to use Claude Code, excellent. But maybe you're just starting out, or maybe you've been using Claude Code for a little while. But one of the most frustrating things that can sometimes go wrong with Claude Code is it might not be working with you exactly as you'd like. It might be making the same sorts of mistakes over again. It might be missing some things. You might have told it a certain way to write in your voice, but it's not sticking to that all the time, or it's not editing files the way you'd like, it's not planning solutions to issues the way you'd like. So how do you fix that? Well, one of the main ways to do that is understanding what your Claude.md is and how to set it up properly. And that's what we're going to cover in this video. So that brings us to explaining what the Claude.md is. Now, if you think about it, one way I kind of think of the Claude.md is a little bit like Claude Code's brain, or you can think of it as sort of Claude Code's handbook that it carries around with it all the time and reads. And it's combined with a few other things that Claude will use, like auto memory. But basically the way it works is if you take your Claude.md, which exists at a few different levels, which we'll go into in a minute. There's a global one and a project level one. Then you also have your auto memory. And these go into every new session that you're doing with Claude Code. They are essentially preloaded. And so these are two files that essentially give Claude guidance on how to act in every session. And they're somewhat similar, but the main difference is that you're responsible for your Claude.md, whereas auto memory, sort of as the name suggests, happens automatically, and therefore Claude Code is responsible for creating it. And essentially what Claude.md is, it's just a file with plain text writing, explaining things like ways to work, details, guidance on where things live, and that sort of thing. And so here's an example Claude.md, and this would be a global level Claude.md or a user level Claude.md. They're the same thing. But as you can see, it's just plain text and headers and body text and then some file references. But there's no code involved in it, it's just text. And it explains some context, some best practices for how Claude Code should work with you, and additional instructions for Claude. And essentially, every time you're working in Claude Code, what you get is Claude, if you excuse my terrible drawings, Claude essentially has its Claude.md, and it will consult it like a little handbook for itself. However, crucially, the Claude.md is at the end of the day guidance for Claude, and so that leads into a few sort of nuances about how you set one up, and I'll go into that in a second because there are placement rules about where you should place important things, because Claude is not absolutely bound by it. It's not hard guardrails, it's more guidance, so Claude will adhere to it, but there can be issues if there are conflicts in it, or if it's not clear, then Claude is sort of left to its own devices to guess how it should act in that situation. So having a good, clear Claude.md is important for getting high quality output, but you can't treat it like an absolute safety net, and that's important to understand because it's not hard guardrails. The other thing we need to understand about Claude.md is that when using the term Claude.md, we're actually sort of talking about a few different things. So a lot of the time when I'm talking about Claude.md, what I'm talking about is your like global user level one, and that will apply to every session across all files and projects you're doing in Claude Code. And so Claude will always read this one at this level, no matter what you're doing. And then below that, what you have is your project level Claude.md, which is going to be scoped to specific projects. So while this one will sit over everything you do, each of these will then have their own project level Claude.md. And if you've seen my video where I talk about the mental models behind working with AI, you might see that this is fairly similar to the way you think about context and sort of master context versus project level context. And what that means is that with a project level Claude.md, you can have information that is specifically relevant to each kind of overall project or build or app you're working on, which isn't going to interfere with others. So you can go into more specific detail in that. And that can also lay out things like which skills or tools are specifically available in that project or specifically going to be used in that project. There's also kind of another higher level Claude.md that sits above that, which is like the enterprise level one. And this is only going to be relevant if you're on like an enterprise or a team plan with Claude. So quite frankly, if you're just using Claude on a personal subscription, a personal account, I wouldn't worry about this too much. It's not that relevant. This is more if you're using Claude Code within an enterprise, but it doesn't really change the fundamentals that we're going to cover about your user level Claude.md and your project level Claude.mds, but it's just something of which to be aware if you're working on an enterprise plan. And I suppose the other thing to understand is that although you have these two different ones, within each project, both of these will be loaded. And you don't necessarily always need a project level Claude.md, but if you do have it, then Claude, when working in sessions in that file or in that project, will read both your user level one and your project level one. And in terms of setting up the actual project Claude.md for each project, there is a command to run called /init, and you can run that, and it will either set up a project level Claude.md if you don't have one, or if you do have one, what it will do is it will update it for you. And so what it looks like to run the init command to set up a project level Claude.md is as simple as just literally typing in init and then enter, and then it should look at the project and look around and then create its own project level Claude.md. And then we can see what Claude has done is it's created a project level Claude.md, and it just outlines kind of key documents in this project, in this file, and what we're building and how it works and conventions of how it should work. And so what is actually involved in making a good Claude.md? And this is sort of more focused on your user level Claude.md, but the same ideas can apply to the project level one. So, as I mentioned earlier, it's not an actual rule book. Claude is not forced to follow what's in the Claude.md. It reads it and uses it as guidance. And understanding that will make these clearer. So one thing you want is you want it to be specific. So that could be very specific things about like good detail about, you know, some context about you, or especially good details about very clear ways you like to work, like always fixing things in this way, always thinking things through from first principles, that sort of thing. Or it could be specifically saying like always use British English or American English or that sort of thing. The other thing you want is specificity in terms of the idea of if you're going to reference additional files, which can often be a good idea, especially as we'll cover in a moment, because you want to keep it short. You might sometimes point it towards external files, like let's say like a context.md about something, about like let's say your business. You might have different ones. So in my Claude.md, I have it directed to a sort of modular context system, so it can go look at like business context or fitness or something like that. And these are different files, and so references to those files, having them referenced specifically, means Claude is going to be more likely to find them accurately. Or you might also want specific reference to like a design.md, which tells Claude always what style your company uses for producing deliverables or websites or resources. And therefore, if this is clearly and specifically signposted in the Claude.md, Claude can work out, oh, we're making some sort of design thing. Let's go look at the design.md. The other thing you want is you want to keep your Claude.md short, because as we said, it's a guidebook for Claude, not hard and fast rules. So if it gets too long, Claude will start, well, there's a few issues if it gets too long. One issue is that if you keep it very long, Claude will not necessarily read through all of it and might not actually follow the guidance you put in there. The other issue is that it is automatically loaded into the context window for every conversation, which therefore means that if it's very, very long, you're going to waste tokens, possibly getting context rot. But even if you're not getting context rot from it, because you have a bigger context window, you are still going to be using more tokens than necessary, which means you're going to burn through your usage limits faster or rack up higher API costs. And along this line of keeping it short, you also want to put the most important rules and guidance early on so that Claude reads them straight away and doesn't miss the most important stuff. And that way they're more likely to be followed. Along the same line sort of specificity, you want good structure. So you want it laid out. Because it's just a markdown file, what you want is kind of nice headings about, like, maybe you'll have like a kind of context heading giving some info, or like a kind of how to work heading. And the thing is, the way to create your Claude.md is not to handwrite it yourself, but to work with Claude to create it. And so you can go back and forth. And then another important thing that you want is you don't want any contradictions, because as we said many times now, this is a guidebook for Claude, so it's going to read through it, but it's not bound by it, which means if there's one kind of rule or guideline early on about a way to work, and then later in the Claude.md that is contradicted, Claude is going to be confused and will essentially just decide arbitrarily which one to follow, which means that it might not work in the way you desire. And if we come back to the example Claude.md, as you can see, it adheres to those principles. So it's under 200 lines, it's structured with headers, and the advice is specific and relevant to, well, in this instance, the example consulting company. And so while it feels like there's a lot of rules you have to remember when setting up a Claude.md, the nice thing is that you can work, and you probably should work, with Claude Code to set it up together. So that means Claude Code should have some understanding of how to create a good Claude.md, and equally what you can do is go to the Anthropic Claude.md docs website and copy and paste that there, and that should help explain the best practices to Claude Code. And so this is the website, the Claude Code docs, that contain lots of good information about Claude.md, and I'll put the link to this in the description, and feel free to read it for even more good detail. But what you can do is copy and paste this, and if you don't have your user level Claude.md set up already, just copy and paste this link and say something like, I want you to help me set up my user level Claude.md. This is a link to the docs page. Let's work through the process collaboratively, interview me and ask me any questions you need, and adhere to the best practices outlined on this page. And then that should help you set up your Claude.md. Or if you're in the state where you've already got a Claude.md but maybe it's not great, then you can do the same thing, copy and paste that link and just say you want to update it. And if you find as you're working that something new occurs, or Claude keeps making the same mistake, just let it know to update its Claude.md to help it fix that mistake going forward. And so it can be an iterative, and it should be sort of a live document that you do update every now and then. However, that can lead to a couple of pitfalls if you do update it all the time. And the main issue with that is sort of bloating of your Claude.md, which means you're going to go against those 4 rules we just discussed for making a good Claude.md. Because if you just keep saying, oh, add this to the Claude.md, you just keep adding more and more and more and more, a few things happen. Firstly, you're very likely to overshoot that 200 line limit, which means that you're going to be wasting tokens when you're loading a very big Claude.md into every session. And it also means you're much more likely to get contradictions. And also, if it's super long, Claude is not going to read it all and is not going to retain all the information in it. So it's actually less likely to adhere to the guidance in the Claude.md anyway if it becomes super long. And so if you start getting a really big Claude.md, it's going to diminish the quality of your Claude Code sessions. And I have certainly been guilty of this in the past. I remember at one point, I had essentially just kept saying, oh, add this to the Claude.md, add this to the Claude.md, to the point where my Claude.md was massive and it was eating up loads of tokens every session, and I was, going through my usage limits faster, not getting the output I wanted. And so I actually just had to do a session with Claude, essentially saying like, all right, let's rewrite my Claude.md from scratch. And so I cut it down to a much leaner Claude.md and got far better outputs after that, especially because I'd also sort of changed some of the ways I was working after getting more experience with Claude Code. And I'm not saying that you have to periodically rewrite your Claude.md entirely, but what I am saying is that although it's nice and easy just to say, okay, rewrite the Claude.md to do this sort of thing, it's worth checking every once in a while that your Claude.md has not become huge and bloated and full of contradictions. And actually, you want to make sure that you're keeping it lean and adhering to those ideas of being specific, short, structured, and avoiding contradictions, because that is going to mean that your Claude Code sessions are going to work better and Claude will feel more useful and won't keep making the same mistakes because you have a good structured Claude.md. And so perhaps you're thinking though, well, if I have to keep my Claude.md lean, how do I make sure that it has all the kind of guidelines and ways I like to work and information I need so that it can actually produce useful Claude Code sessions? And that is where I suggest you sort of think of your Claude.md as a central brain and handbook for Claude that can direct to several other more detailed, let's say, rules or specific handbooks, if you want to continue the analogy. I know I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but what you can do is reference file paths within the Claude.md that will say something like, if you detect we're doing client work, go read the client context markdown file, which is going to have way more information on all the clients for your business, for example. Or let's say Claude is directed at a brand.md that has brand guidelines for producing slide decks, for example, and if it ever detects that we're working on a presentation of that sort, it will go and read the brand.md, and that direction as to where that file is stored will be within the Claude.md, but not all of this detail will be in the Claude.md. So that allows you to keep your Claude.md lean and short, adhering to those rules, but it doesn't mitigate the ability to go and have it reference much more detailed documents. And you can kind of see how you can expand this. And if we come back to our example, Claude.md one more time, we can see the idea of it routing Claude code to other reference files in action. So here it specifies when to reference which other files which will have much more detail, and that way they're not always auto-loaded, but Claude Code can go look at them when relevant. And so those are really some of the core ways to think about your Claude.md, remembering that you have both a user level and a project level one, and thinking about keeping it short, specific, structured, and avoiding contradictions, but also acknowledging that you can have it route itself to other more detailed documents. And so hopefully this video was useful in helping you understand what a Claude.md was and how to set it up and why it's important. And if you want more Claude Code and AI tips, please make sure to subscribe. And if you want even more detailed step-by-step guidance on everything Claude Code and AI, and also actual feedback from me on things like your Claude.md and troubleshooting it and anything along those lines, then feel free to check out my school community as well, which will be linked in the description.